Time-restricted eating, calorie restriction, and body weight. In today's video, we're going to discuss the recently published paper that compared calorie restriction to calorie restriction with time-restricted eating and how each impacted weight loss. We're also going to discuss some previous studies which showed some benefits to time-restricted eating under various circumstances, and we're going to look at how this recently published paper kind of fits in with that and incorporates itself into the time-restricted eating zeitgeist. The name of this recently published paper, Calorie Restriction with or Without Time-Restricted Eating in Weight Loss. This caused kind of a freak out based on the results. Of course, you have the intermittent fasting slash time-restricted feeding proponents saying this is a BS study. And then you have the people who are, strict, calories in, calories out, calorie restriction trumps all, showing that, see, there is no benefit. Most of the benefit to time-restricted eating comes from the calorie restriction. Personally, I fall more towards most of the benefits come from calorie restriction. I do actually do time-restricted eating myself. I do early time-restricted eating. We'll discuss that a little bit later, but let's kind of focus on what they found in this study so that we can see what these results are actually telling us and why there's really no reason to freak out about these results. This is effectively what we would expect from this study based on all of the data, if you're looking at it from a truly unbiased perspective. So what they did in this study was they randomly assigned 139 patients who were obese to time-restricted eating with calorie restriction or simply just calorie restriction. So what does that entail? So everybody in the study was calorie restricted. If they were male, they were eating between 1,500 to 1,800 calories per day. If they were female, they were eating between 1,200 and 1,500 calories per day for women. If they were in the time-restricted eating group, they were told to eat between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4 p.m., whereas if they were in the calorie restriction only group, they were not really kind of advised into how they should time their meals. However, it's important they stuck to what they were doing before, which actually in and of itself kind of qualifies for time-restricted eating. So they did this, and they wanted to see what would happen over the course of a year. A lot of short-term trials, you can see benefits with different dietary patterns, whether you're talking about low carb, keto, vegan, any sort of calorie restriction or low fat. Any of these dietary patterns generally work short term, but over the long term, people kind of revert back to where they were. So this is a pretty interesting study because they followed these people for a year and looked at the results after a year. Before we go diving into the results of the study, let's just kind of discuss what TRE is, time-restricted eating. It's important to point out that a lot of people use terminologies interchangeably, like, for example, intermittent fasting. A lot of people consider TRE intermittent fasting, and TRE is a form of intermittent fasting, but it is kind of separate because intermittent fasting could be eating one day and then not eating another. It could have 5 days during the week where you're eating a normal calorie level and then 2 days where you're dramatically reducing that or eliminating it altogether. So TRE is really a specific form of intermittent fasting where it's an eating pattern where people restrict their food intake to certain parts of the day. This is consistent. So for example, if you pick a 10-hour feeding window, you keep that consistently throughout the week. And generally speaking, the recommendation for time-restricted eating is 10 to 12 hours. Some people do less, but most people are going to find that 10 to 12 hours is best for them. So we can look at a bunch of different time-restricted eating windows. People select them more or less based on ease of use or what fits within their kind of lifestyle. So, for example, 12 p.m. noon to 8 p.m. is a very common TRE schedule. That is actually 16 hours fasting, 8 hours feeding. There is 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., which is kind of where I fall on the kind of continuum. So that's actually a 10-hour eating window, and then there's 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. There's many ways that you can really do this, but the most important thing is, generally speaking, it's less than 12 hours of feeding, and it is consistently throughout the same times every day, and the goal being to kind of align your feeding patterns with your circadian rhythms, which do differ between individuals, but for the most part, there do seem to be some trends which are important. So the purported benefits of following time-restricted eating throughout the day is improved metabolism, enhanced longevity, and reduced chronic disease. Most of these, again, are going to be attributed to aligning your behavioral patterns with your circadian rhythms. Now that we have this whole, what is TRE out of the way, what were the findings of this study? Well, first, there was no benefit of adding time-restricted eating to calorie restriction for weight loss in these obese participants. There was a small and significant weight loss after a year, 8 kilograms of weight loss in the TRE plus calorie restriction, and 6.3 kilograms of weight loss in calorie restriction only. There were no changes in BMI, lean body mass, body fat, waist circumference, etc., etc. But it is important to note kind of something that is almost certainly attributed to this being done in Chinese individuals, and that is the participants in this study, prior to this study, were eating within an 11-hour feeding window anyway. So they were eating in an 11-hour window, which is different than here. Dr. Sachin Panda has done some studies and found that most of us are consuming food in a 14-hour feeding window in the United States and most Western cultures. So here, the feeding window went from 11 hours to 8 hours. But there are some important takeaways to this. Again, we're dealing with obese individuals, and if prior to this study these individuals were eating in an 11-hour feeding window, clearly eating in an 11-hour time-restricted feeding window was not helping them manage their weight, so that's important to consider. Moving from 11 hours to 8 hours didn't help them that much. It was an insignificant measure, so it could simply be measurement error. And it's hard to take this and put it into the same category as an American eating 14 hours a day and then cutting down to, say, a 10-hour feeding window. But it isn't such a huge difference that you would think that the results would be any different. Truth be told, time-restricted eating isn't great for weight loss in humans. There's no good evidence for it to aid in weight loss. There is evidence that it is a healthier pattern and may lead to metabolic improvements. But for the most part, if you're trying to lose weight, you need to calorie restrict. And if you are calorie restricted, adding TRE really is not going to add that much. If we just look at this paper for what it is, it led to an additional 1.7 kilograms of weight loss, even though, again, you can't really do that because these are insignificant results. But if we were to assume they were significant, they're still not clinically meaningful weight loss. We're talking about 1.7 kilograms over the course of a year. For those of you like me in the United States, that's less than 4 pounds over the course of a year. So this is really not surprising unless you get all of your information on time-restricted eating from popular diet books. It's simply never really been shown in humans that time-restricted eating is going to lead to more weight loss than calorie restriction, and it shouldn't. We should look at these things separately in terms of wanting to live a long time, maintaining a healthy weight, and all that stuff. Calorie restriction is still king. Time-restricted eating may add a little bit to that, but as you'll see with the other data we discussed, the benefits of time-restricted eating are more about hedging against poor behaviors than optimizing. What this study tells us, calorie restriction is king for weight loss, not surprising. There's no evidence that anything other than calorie restriction will lead to weight loss. In other words, if you restrict carbs, if you don't eat X, Y, Z, if you do time-restricted eating, if you do 1 meal a day, if you do intermittent fasting, the 5-2 diet, ultimately, if you lose weight, it's going to be due to calorie restriction. That does not mean that that you have to count calories. Most people don't. In fact, most people won't, so it's better to find a pattern where they are not required to count calories. But ultimately speaking, you need to be in an energy balance deficit in order to lose weight. No surprise there, all of the data points in that direction. Anyway, it does show that TRE is an option for weight loss if it leads to calorie restriction, and it does in many people. I've worked with a lot of people that TRE has worked for. I've also worked with a lot of people that TRE has not worked for. It's going to be different. What works for an individual is going to be different. Finding out if TRE works for you is going to require you to try out time-restricted eating, but it's not going to lead to weight loss unless it leads to calorie restriction, and the weight loss is not going to be any better than calorie restriction alone. Selecting a dietary pattern that leads to calorie restriction for you is the ideal if your goal is to lose weight. This is going to be different for everyone. You probably know somebody who keto worked for, and maybe it didn't work for you, or maybe it worked for you and it didn't work for somebody else. This is not a failure necessarily of the diet or the individual. It is an incompatibility with the individual and the selected dietary pattern. time restricted eating is going to be no different. Some people, they can kind of tweak this. So for example, a lot of people want to do that 16-8 diet where they are only eating in an 8-hour feeding window, but this can cause them to binge when they do eat. Alternatively, people may have dietary patterns that do not line up with their normal daily activity lifestyle patterns, and that can lead to overconsumption of food. And a lot of people simply think they're going to do TRE and eat whatever they want and achieve weight loss and be healthy, but that's simply not going to happen. TRE is going to work for weight loss just as any other type of approach works, and that is going to be through calorie restriction. Whether you choose to actually count calories or not is totally up to you. You can count carbs, you can work on more exercise, you can do time restricted eating. As long as you're in a calorie restricted state, that will provide success for you. So now let's take a look at some of the other data in time-restricted eating in humans, some of the things we see other than weight loss, which we don't see when you control for calories. But what do we see in other data in humans in terms of changes in metabolism and things of that nature? So this paper that we're discussing here is looking at time-restricted eating in type 2 diabetics. What they found is time-restricted eating can improve fasting insulin sensitivity, carbohydrate tolerance, glucose excursions. But how is this working? What we're finding is that you are effectively aligning your feeding window with your circadian rhythms. We're going to have a video on that. There's a lot of confusion with that. People don't quite understand what circadian rhythms are, diurnal rhythms, and how what we're doing on a day-to-day basis creates these rhythms within our physiology. Part of that is driven by circadian rhythms, which are inherent within our cells. Others are related to our behavior and things of that nature. So what they believe with time-restricted eating, specifically early time-restricted eating, but time-restricted eating in general as well, that you are aligning your feeding window with your circadian rhythms, which will improve metabolic function, lead to fewer detrimental metabolic consequences. Additionally, it will decrease oxidative stress. It's also working through circadian rhythms. You're increasing oxidative stress, generally speaking, during your feeding window, and you are decreasing oxidative stress during your fasting window. So here you're aligning that, effectively you're aligning the day-night cycle with your behavioral patterns, which create oxidative stress. And so kind of within circadian rhythms, repairing oxidative stress also follows a circadian rhythm, our ability to, quench free radicals. So what you're doing with time-restricted eating is you're aligning that such that when you create oxidative stress, you're also able to repair it effectively as well. But it's important to point out, they did not have a comparator group in any of these kind of papers covered in this review. So this was not independent of weight loss. All these things happened with time-restricted eating, but that time-restricted eating generally leads to a weight loss of 1 to 4%. So you can't say that it's time-restricted eating only. Certainly there are mechanistic studies that do support this. There are studies in mice which show that when you put them into time-restricted eating, you see improvements in measures within the liver clock, the circadian clock within the liver. You see better improvements when you calorie restrict them, but when you take a set number of calories and kind of compress it into a specific feeding window, you do see improvements in liver function and the circadian rhythms within the liver when you do time-restricted eating versus ad libitum and you're controlling for calories. However, that doesn't mean that time-restricted eating leads to weight loss. It means that it has an independent beneficial effect on your metabolism, which may be beneficial for preventing cardiometabolic disease. Here we have another review paper, which, again, this is kind of explaining what happens in the human studies. Basically, they find that aligning your food intake with your circadian rhythm improves glucose tolerance. This makes perfect sense. There are periods of the day when we are more insulin sensitive. There are periods of the day when we're going to secrete more insulin based on a set amount of glucose. So you're going to be able to better deal with that. Generally speaking, that's going to happen during the day. And what we're doing here is we're aligning our hormonal clock. So a standard person eating ad libitum, or switching up their schedule due to social jet lag, meaning, during the work week they have one schedule, but during the, weekend when they're partying, they have a different schedule. You end up getting desynchronization of your hormonal clocks. So we're talking about different hormones that affect your metabolism, such as ghrelin, adiponectin, insulin, leptin, and these things are going to regulate behavior as well. For example, ghrelin is a hunger hormone. So what happens when you are doing time restricted eating and you align your feeding cycle with your circadian rhythms, you see improvements in cardiometabolic factors, and this is due to aligning your circadian clocks with your behavioral patterns and preventing this kind of hormonal desynchronization that happens based on how most of us live our lives. So it's kind of taking advantage of the natural variations in how our hormones work by aligning your time-restricted eating feeding schedule towards the day-night cycle. This figure gives us a kind of a better representation, like a good visual representation of what we're talking about here, with aligning your behavioral patterns with your circadian rhythms to kind of help align your hormonal milieu, if you will. So what the idea is that aligning your clocks, your behavioral clock and your circadian clock, will improve appetite, postprandial responses to meals, which basically means your glucose response to meals, your triglyceride response to meals, all of your lipids, alertness, sleep, and performance. Generally speaking, early time-restricted eating is better, and that's because we are a diurnal species, meaning we are awake during the day and asleep at night. So what happens is when we kind of misalign these patterns, where our our feeding and activity patterns are kind of misaligned with the day-night cycle, we can get these problems in cardiometabolic responses, things like your cholesterol levels, triglycerides, glucose, and things of that nature. So here we can just take a look at how, as humans, what should we see? Where should the hormones peak? And what we find is melatonin will peak. It's on the right side of the chart. Will peak overnight. Fibroblast growth factor 21, which is a kind of a fasting hormone, will peak during the night also. Cortisol will peak just as we're waking up in the morning. Ghrelin, you'll see 3 peaks. Those are kind of behavioral markers. Ghrelin will peak generally about a half hour before scheduled meals. So if you, in this instance, this person eats at 8 a.m., at 1 p.m., and 6 p.m. So ghrelin's going to peak before those hours. It's almost acting as a marker for where food presents itself, which isn't something we really need to use now since food is freely available. But when we are a wild animal trying to attain food, having peaks in ghrelin would, at certain times of the day, would signify when food is generally available. And so those ghrelin peaks are really important under wild conditions. Adiponectin, another hormone which is important for cardiometabolic function. Same with leptin and insulin. These are all variable throughout the day. When you look at insulin, secretion will peak generally later in the day, and between 2 to 6 p.m. And leptin, you may have heard of leptin. Leptin is a hunger-based hormone, but it actually is really important for our circadian rhythms. It plays a lot of roles in our health. It can be inflammatory as well. Leptin is generally going to peak later on, so like between the hours of 4 p.m. and 2 a.m. And it's important to note that leptin is the kind of the hormone that tells us to stop eating. So when we're eating, it helps us say we're full, helps us understand that. It's secreted by fat cells, so once you start eating and then the food begins going into the fat cells, that helps the fat cells secrete leptin, saying, listen, we've had enough food. So all these hormones can really get messed up when you have cardiometabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, things of that nature. So the idea behind time-restricted eating is that it can help align these hormones to help prevent cardiometabolic disease. But it's important to point out what we're normally comparing time-restricted eating to. We're normally comparing time-restricted eating to ad libitum eating, meaning people who eat anything at any time during the day. So TRE is better than eating all throughout the day. And so it may be a way to hedge against more kind of obesogenic patterns, people who overeat, people who eat kind of junk food most of the time. TRE may provide some benefit over not doing TRE and just eating that 24/7. But for the most part, all the studies in humans are comparing TRE to ad libitum food intake. TRE is better than that, but as we're probably going to see over the course of the next few years, calorie restriction is king. Most of the benefits from TRE are going to come from calorie restriction. There may be some additional benefit to doing TRE, but it does seem, based on what we have now, that that is not for optimization. It's more for hedging against the negative consequences of our, normal Western modern lifestyle. Here we have some more data, again, comparing ad libitum to TRE. Moving from ad libitum feeding to TRE improved multiple things. It decreased waist circumference, improved blood pressure, blood glucose, triglycerides. Basically, it lowered hemoglobin A1C, which would be a 3-month average, and it improved restful sleeping. But it's important to point out, again, we are comparing people who are eating with an over 14-hour feeding window to people who are eating around a 10-hour eating window. And again, they were not controlling for calories, so much of the benefits, since they lost weight, we have to assume they were calorie restricted. There's no evidence that weight loss happens in any other situation. So again, most of the legwork is probably coming from calorie restriction, but some of it may be independent of calorie restriction. Certainly you would figure the blood glucose, blood pressure, and triglycerides would all be important. Hemoglobin A1C as well, simply because there is this circadian rhythm of insulin sensitivity and carb tolerance. Now, again, we're coming back to the same kind of, we're getting this same kind of story here. TRE is shown to be way better than the standard way of eating. It may offset some of the problems associated with an obesogenic lifestyle, but it is not going to correct obesity. It's not going to lead to appreciable weight loss. It doesn't show that in here. Like, they're not comparing this to, like, as this study that we talked about at the beginning, where they took calorie restriction and kept it constant and then just added TRE or no TRE. So these people lost weight. They would lose waist circumference as well. If they did that, they were probably calorie restricted. This paper did not control for calories. This brings us to an important discussion on dietary patterns and weight loss, one you are probably aware of, but subconsciously, and that's that some dietary patterns work for some people some of the time. However, most won't work for most of the people most of the time. As I mentioned earlier, you probably have a friend who lost a lot of weight doing keto, stuck to it long term, maintained their weight loss. They're doing great. You tried it, just banged back and forth. You would be compliant sometimes, but not others, and ultimately it failed for you. Same thing with calorie restriction, the CICO. Some people count calories and they keep track of the calories they eat and the calories they burn, and they use that to kind of create an energy balance, a negative energy balance that leads to weight loss. That works for some people. It doesn't work for most people, and it doesn't work most of the time. Ultimately, we have a number of dietary patterns or ways of eating that we can use to lose weight, maintain a healthy weight and BMI, and ultimately the most important thing for you is finding out which one of those is compatible with your lifestyle and things of that nature. The most important factor is finding something that you can be compliant with, not feel like you're kind of preventing yourself from enjoying life, and that, is kind of flexible with your lifestyle. So, TRE, whether it be early time restricted eating or, later time restricted eating, can work. Ultimately, it will work if it leads to compliance. Now, it's important to point out that just because TRE works does not mean that calorie restriction is not necessary. In order for TRE to work for weight loss, it needs to lead to calorie restriction. And ultimately, that's finding what works for you. For some people doing time restricted eating, they get this perception that they can eat whatever they want, and they can't. It's really important to get people to understand that. The idea is to find a way for you to limit the number of calories you eat in a way that you don't think about it and that you don't feel like you're being deprived of anything. So for time restricted eating, a lot of the important factors associated with that is finding both the proper window length and when you put that window. So what works best for you? Do you do an 8-hour window, a 10-hour window, or a 12-hour window? If you're somebody who's doing an 8-hour window, you may be binging at the beginning of that window, or you may binge towards the end of that window. And so maybe an 8-hour window isn't good for you, or maybe it is, but maybe it's best to have that 8-hour window from noon to 8 p.m. That's not really ideal in terms of the cardiometabolic responses to your food related to circadian rhythms. But if it leads to weight loss, ultimately weight loss is doing most of the heavy lifting for these health improvements, and that's going to happen through calorie restriction. So you have a lot of options here. You can do an 8, 10, 12 hour feeding window. You can put that window early, you can put it late, but ultimately it's really important with time restricted eating that you also consider other factors. Time restricted eating is not going to lead to weight loss if you're just going to binge on food all day long. You need to kind of add other sort of attributes to your diet, such as maybe sticking to 3 meals or sticking to certain types of food. You can do low carb and TRE, you can do low fat and TRE, or you can count your calories. There are many ways to kind of go about it. Making TRE work for you. So if you're going to take TRE for a test run, it's important to find your best window. Generally, for most people, earlier is better. That's because of the circadian rhythm, where our insulin sensitivity and our carb tolerance is generally earlier during the day. There's also a number of other metabolic things that kind of go on. You're more likely to oxidize energy during the day than store it, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, the amount of calories you're consuming is important on that. For late eaters, a lot of the times they do not want to do an earlier window, but that is actually the best for them. What do I mean by that? A lot of people, say you're working a regular 9 to 5, you go to the gym after you get home at 6:30, and then you eat your largest meal at, 7, 8 o'clock at night. So you're generally going to be eating most of your calories at night. So if you cut that back and say, do your feeding window until 6, you will eat less, and that will lead to weight loss. So people who are generally, those people who are going to get home, they're going to eat dinner, and then they're going to snack until bedtime. An earlier window is generally better. The length of the window is going to vary. If you are a binger, do not do an 8-hour window. Start with a 12-hour window. You can bring that down. Just kind of slowly introduce yourself to time-restricted eating. There are some benefits to appetite with time-restricted eating for the people that it works. They generally become more comfortable with being hungry, so they're less likely to binge. But if you are currently a binger and you haven't taken time-restricted eating for a walk yet, start with a 12-hour window, not an 8-hour window. Realize that food quality matters. If you eat garbage, you're not going to be able to restrict the amount you eat. Ultra-processed foods generally drive more food consumption. Eating snacks and things of that nature does the same. As just mentioned, a shorter window is not necessarily better. It all depends on the individual. Some people are already fine with, they're fine with the feeling of hunger. They don't feel that they necessarily have to jump to eat the second they're hungry. Those people are probably fine with an 8-hour window. If you find every day that whether you're doing it, you wake up first thing in the morning and you gorge, or you kind of skip breakfast, you eat a small lunch, and then you are just kind of binging on food at night, selecting a longer window is probably better for you until you become adjusted to having a 12-hour or more fasting period. And finally, most importantly of all, stick to it. This is where most people fail. Yeah, I'm going to do time-restricted eating Monday through Friday, and then on the weekends I'm going to let myself kind of, I'm going to let my hair down and do what I want, or I'm going to do this from January till April, May, and then as spring and summer come, I'm just going to kind of throw it by the wayside. Any sort of dietary pattern that's going to benefit your health is going to be one that you do for the length of your life. So kind of, you want to take TRE if it's something that you want to do. You're going to have to take it and make it fit for you and make it so that you are compliant so that you stick to it. When we look at this paper, this new paper that didn't show any benefit to TRE above what would happen with calorie restriction anyway, I think it fits nicely into what we already know based on the data we have in humans. I know that might be kind of something that is novel to you because maybe you've seen a bunch of blog posts on intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating, or you've read some popular diet books. I think the idea that TRE is better than calorie restriction on its own is not really based in reality and is more kind of kind of just a component of the diet space, the nutrition landscape. People don't want calories to matter for one reason or another, but ultimately there's no data that shows that you can lose weight without being in a caloric deficit. This TRE is literally no different. It just gets confusing for people. They read popular diet books, and they read in these diet books that a calorie is not a calorie, or calories don't matter, or a CICO, which is calories in, calories out, is a poor method for weight loss. But ultimately, every method of weight loss is bad because most people don't stick to diets. And calories do matter. Calories are essential to weight loss. You cannot lose weight without being on a calorie deficit. That is consistent within the literature. The only place it really isn't is in these popular diet books. I almost feel like a lot of the times they're trying to sell people something that isn't. Hey, do TRE, you don't have to count calories, and calories don't matter, which you don't need to count calories, and it may work for you, but calories absolutely do matter. So it just gets confusing for many people. And unfortunately what happens is they try something like time-restricted eating and it doesn't work for them, and they think it means that there's something wrong with them, and it's not. They simply haven't found the dietary pattern or the way of eating that works for them. And this paper effectively holds up everything we know. Calorie restriction likely does most of the heavy lifting for time-restricted eating, as it does with every dietary approach. At least for weight loss, there may be some additional benefits to TRE, and seems like the data is pointing in that direction for improvements in cardiometabolic risk factors such as blood glucose, triglycerides, lipids, and things of that nature. TRE, intermittent fasting, low carb, carnivore, vegan, they're not magic. If they lead to weight loss, then there's calorie restriction. You may not have counted your calories, and chances are if you think you lost weight without a calorie restricted state, then chances are you just didn't count your calories in the first place, which is fine. You don't need to count calories, but you were in a calorie restricted state. Now, this paper that we just discussed doesn't really tell us anything in terms of cardiometabolic benefits. It simply focuses on weight loss. I think ultimately when we're looking at TRE, the benefits we see for TRE, where it's going to provide the most benefit to people, is hedging against some of the negative aspects of obesity that are caused by our modern lifestyle. So if people are not going to lose weight, doing time-restricted eating is likely better for their health than just eating all the time. Certainly that's been kind of upheld in the human literature, by far in kind of the rodent literature. But it does seem that TRE may hedge against some of these negative aspects of obesity, but calorie restriction is king. If you calorie restrict, it's going to provide better results. Calorie restriction with TRE does not appear to cause that much better of an improvement, but hey, like I said, I do time restricted eating. I've known for a while that it's not going to lead to better weight loss than if I just calorie restrict, but I do feel that some of these benefits to cardiometabolic risk markers is worth the extra effort, and it's not really any extra effort for me now. It just, when you get used to a different type of way of eating, over time it just becomes your way of eating, so you don't really need to change it, and it doesn't really feel like an effort. So again, TRE is going to fit into this box where it hedges against some of the bad effects of our modern way of living, but ultimately, if you calorie restrict, you're going to get most of the benefit doing that, whether you're doing time restricted eating or not. So thank you very much for listening in. I hope this gave you some perspective on what this study is. I hope it helped you understand why this is not really a surprising result. If you look at the actual literature, this is exactly what you would expect to see. But if you're coming about this study from somebody who, promotes intermittent fasting, or, time restricted eating, or circadian rhythms are the most important thing above all other things, then it might have seemed like a surprise to you, but it's really not, based on the literature. And don't let that be a reason why you decide to stop doing time restricted eating, because there does seem to be other beneficial effects. And if it works for you right now, why change? So thank you very much for listening in, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please put a comment down in the comment section below. If you liked it and you think it benefited other people, please share it on social media. Don't forget to subscribe to us on our YouTube channel, and thank you very much.